You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast, the hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com, thechrisvossshow.com. Hey, we're coming here with another great podcast. We certainly appreciate you guys tuning in. I'm sure you're going to be very interested in the topic we'll be talking about today. We got an amazing book author on the show. The editor's pick, best books of 2022 so far. We have Elizabeth Williamson is going to be on the show with us talking about her book, Sandy Hook. An American Tragedy and Battle for the Truth that came out March 8th, 2022. We've been really trying to get her on the show since publishing her book. And she finally got time for us because she's really popular with the stories she told here. So in the meantime, be sure to refer the show to your family, friends, and relatives. Go to youtube.com/Chris Voss, hit the bell notification button. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss. See everything we read and review over there. Go see all of our groups, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, the big LinkedIn newsletter, the big LinkedIn group over there on LinkedIn. And also go see our new courses and stuff at chrisvossleadershipinstitute.com. See that over there. So she is on the show with us today. Her book, once again, Sandy Hook, An American Tragedy and Battle for Truth. You can order up on Amazon or wherever fine books are sold, but don't go into those alleyway bookstores. They can be dirty, and you might need a tetanus shot if you go to those alleyway bookstores. So go to the fine bookstores. She is the author of this amazing book published by Dutton. She is a feature writer in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times and a former member of the New York Times editorial board. She has worked at the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post and spent a decade as a foreign correspondent in Eastern Europe. Welcome to the show, Elizabeth. How are you?
Hey, Chris, I'm fine. I'm glad to be with you finally.
And it's an honor to have you on the show. We've had so many people from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all those different places on the show. So we just keep adding to the alumni on the show. So it's great. You guys put out you guys have all these great journalists who put out great books.
Well, thank you. I have to say one thing before we get started, and that's that my son, Charlie Williamson, is a salesperson at Reported Future, a cybersecurity firm. And he was the one who said to me, "Oh my God, you're going on Chris Voss's show. I can't believe it." So he's a big fan. I just want to pass that to you.
There you go. That's awesome. So let's start with the book. .coms. Where can people find you and get to know more about you and the book on the interwebs?
Well, you can obviously look up the book at Penguin. My publisher, Dutton, which is a Penguin imprint, you can find it there. They're on their page. And you can look I post a lot of material about the book on my Twitter account, which is at NYTLits.
Okay. There you go. So what motivated you want to write this book? What struck a chord in you that said this story, I've got a story that we can tell here?
Well, Chris, in the middle of 2018, a group of Sandy Hook families sued Alex Jones of InfoWars for defamation. And initially, I thought this would be a really interesting test of the First Amendment and whether it, as Alex Jones and other conspiracy theorists claim, protects people who spread these kinds of falsehoods that result in harm to vulnerable people like the Sandy Hook families. But as I spoke with Lenny Posner, who's the father of Noah Posner, the youngest Sandy Hook victim, he illuminated me to the fact that Sandy Hook and the conspiracy theories that followed the mass shooting in 2012 was really a foundational story of how misinformation and disinformation and false narratives have gained traction in our society. And sure enough, as I began working on the book, it went from Sandy Hook to conspiracy theories around most mass shootings, Pizzagate, QAnon, Charlottesville, coronavirus myths, and finally the 2020 election conspiracies that brought the insurrectionists to the Capitol on January 6, 2021.
Mm-hmm. I first became aware of Alex Jones. I was staying with a friend's house in 2011, I think 2010, 2011. I was visiting a friend down in LA for an event. And so I was down there for like a week. And I remember I was sitting we were sitting and working on our laptops, and we're okay, let's go to the event. And he turned off his router, and then he unplugged the router, like the cable and all, from the wall. And I go, what the hell are you doing? Yeah. And he goes, well, you might think I'm crazy, but yeah, just trust me, it's safer this way. And I'm like, I work in IT, like, never seen this before.
Take a SIM card out of your cell phone.
And so, technically you have to do that if you go to, DEF CON. But because, there's hackers there and, that's what they're after. But, oh my gosh. So I said, no, and I pressed him and I said, why do you do this? And he goes, well, I listen to Alex Jones. And I'm like, who the hell is Alex Jones? And, he told me about the Illuminati. Can, even if the power's off, it's unplugged, the Illuminati can still activate power in that hub. And I'm like, you're an unemployed guy who's like a nobody in the middle of nowhere. Like, is the Illuminati really losing sleep at night?
Right.
So, then I discovered Alex Jones. When I went to his site, I could see his whole, I could see him selling stuff that was fear-based.
Yeah.
Monetary system. And I'm like, okay, I know this guy's angle. I know what he's up to. I study religion all my life. Hey, folks, this is a quick break-in from the show. Hey, be sure to check out my new courses at chrisvossleadershipinstitute.com. That's chrisvossleadershipinstitute.com/courses, or you can just click the courses tab. You can see we've got new courses up for how to start a podcast and video training that can get you up to date on everything we're doing. Of course, my speaking, my coaching, and everything else. But be sure to check out the new course that we have up for starting your own podcast. After 13 years, I'm kind of sharing some of the secrets of what I know. So be sure to check that out at chrisvossleadership.com/courses. So how did you get into the story? How did you develop it? And what did you find?
Yeah, as you know, Alex Jones has a pretty ingenious business model, and that's that, he has an audience of tens of millions of people who are deeply distrustful of the government. They're distrustful of the mainstream media. They're distrustful of most official narratives. And they felt like, in the case of Sandy Hook, that, this was a so-called false flag. An event that was planned by the government as a pretext for confiscating Americans' firearms. And so, actually, it didn't happen like that. But what he's able to do is to sell products to people who share that mindset. So it's, alternate medicines and diet supplements for people who distrust traditional medicine. It is doomsday prepper merchandise for people who are preparing for the end of times. As you know, untraceable gun parts, ghost gun parts for people who don't want to register a firearm with the federal government. So it really is an ingenious business model, and he's a great salesman. But unfortunately, with Sandy Hook, he did something that was new even for him, and that's that he named the individual parents, not all, but some of them. And that resulted in an absolute tidal wave of abuse and stalking and harassment of them. And it lasted years.
Was there a foundation laid for this because with 9/11? Because the first conspiracies I really saw that started really getting out there. And of course, it came around the advent of the internet too, the awakening of 9/11. Yeah. They came around the advent of the internet too, and it's almost like the crazy people just found other people like them. I don't know. Yeah,
that was the thing. You and I, we all know conspiracy theorists, right? They're the person who buttonholes you at the family reunion that tell you their JFK theories or the moon landing, or they're the person who hands you, a sheet that they, photocopied themselves on the subway or on the street corner. But with the internet and social media, these individuals find each other and they build communities, and they become very dependent on circulating and embroidering and spreading this hoax content. And they invent new identities for themselves. So, in the Sandy Hook book, I interview a number of people who, one of them was a house mover in Florida, had small business. And he sort of reinvented himself as a citizen journalist, as an investigator. as you know, in investigating Sandy Hook and all subsequent high-profile mass shootings and calling all of them hoaxes. There's another woman out in Oklahoma. She had a house cleaning business. She became, an author and a kind of, high-profile member of the Sandy Hook hoax group. So it really is hard to dissuade people when they get that much psychic income from spreading and circulating and doubting all of these official narratives.
Yeah, I was going to add to that legacy that you talked about where, they can build these sites and they can do all the stuff. Then they can go that third wave where they make money at it. We see a lot of people, who support Trump because they make money selling flags and going to the events and selling hats. And,
yeah,
it's I don't know if you'd even call it a cottage industry at this point. It seems pretty mainstream, but they can make money doing it. And a lot of people that I've seen with a lot of conspiracies, especially with the COVID conspiracies, that have since awoken, they got COVID, some sort of thing pierced their bubble, and they realized they were spreading false narratives. Even when they finally come clean, they realized that one of the driving factors that I've seen in their interviews is the fact they were making money, that they were, or not only sometimes they were making money, but they were a leader for the first time in their life. Yeah. It's kind of like that power they get when, someone becomes the HOA president for the first time. And, he's worked at McDonald's all of his life. This is his first power he's gotten. And suddenly he goes Stalinist on the neighborhood.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Chris. And what you're saying really makes me think of one of these conspiracy theorists in particular, a guy named Wolfgang Halbig, lives in South Florida, had been a school administrator, a school safety administrator, and an educator earlier in his life. He had spent a single year, 1 year, as a state cop in Florida. He put all of that sort of biography together and kind of declared himself an investigator. He actually offered his services to Newtown to get to the bottom of the crime. And when, his sort of, pitch was lost in all of the traffic and all of the mayhem that surrounded the event, he got angry, took it personally, and he decided to call this a hoax. And he's raised more than $100,000 to investigate, to send hundreds of public records requests to Newtown, to the Board of Education, to try and ask for any kind of, camera video, dashboard cam video, transcripts, records, including some pretty macabre stuff, like the receipts for cleaning, blood and brain matter, as he put it, from school. So he just made a really pernicious pest of himself, and he did it for years and still does it, still sends emails.
So in your research, you talk a lot in the book about Alex Jones. Is Alex Jones kind of helped found a lot of this? I had another friend. I had finally had to get rid of that one friend with the Illuminati stuff because he would call me up and tell me, Illuminati stuff. Then I had another friend who started listening to Alex Jones, and I started getting these calls. They happened, I think it was around, it was when the FEMA things were in New Orleans after the big hurricane. And he's like, they're going to take those FEMA trucks and they're going to put everyone into the whole nation's going to go into camps, camps, internment camps. And we're going to live in those FEMA trucks, and they're going to cut the nation down from 350 million to 300,000. And I'm like, why? Because all the rich people want to make money off of us. Well, don't the rich people, wouldn't you rather make money off of 350? Just logically, it doesn't make any sense. But it was in 3 months. It was going to happen. And then I called him up, and I'm like, hey man, we hit the 3 months mark. What's up, dude? Go get help. So we've all known, I grew up, even when I was a teenager, I'm 54 years old now. When even I was a teenager up here in American Park, Utah, which is kind of backwoods. I grew up in California. There are always, these guys with guns, these cowboys in the back. They're, the government's bad. God have guns. There's always that backwoods mentality, and anti-government stuff. But now it just seems with the advent of the internet, it's really taken off. I heard a comedian say one time that nowadays with the internet, the dumb people can find each other and repopulate.
Not only, conspiracy theorists, but the militia groups that, Alex Jones was close to from his earliest days. So the Oath Keepers, very much involved in the January 6th insurrection. Stuart Rhodes, the founder of the Oath Keepers, was on Alex Jones's show right after Sandy Hook, talking about, whether or not this happened, but more importantly, that people within the school shouldn't have been armed. So he has deep ties to those individuals. And to your earlier question, what he's doing is amplifying the claims of people like Wolfgang Halbig. So this educator out of Florida he made 24 trips to Newtown, many of them with an InfoWars camera crew in tow.
Wow.
So he was filming his activities with this crew, and then he was a regular guest on InfoWars. So it gave him an unbelievable reach just beyond social media. It gave him access to Alex Jones's audience.
And then he's now, I was just reading, he's really fighting through the depositions. He's moving his assets around, filing bankruptcy, doing all sorts of different plays. He knows he's really in the skids on this. Do you think he's going to end up with some sort of penalty and end up losing that legal battle?
Yeah, so our discussion today is really well timed, Chris, because on Monday, which would be July 25th, it's the beginning of the trials in which juries will decide how much Alex Jones has to pay Sandy Hook families in damages for these defamation claims. So he evaded the deposition process, the discovery process in the run-up to these trials, that he was basically declared liable by default, meaning he lost the case, didn't have a chance to prove himself or answer for himself in court because he was so obstructive of the process of discovery. So late last year, he lost all 3 cases. So these cases are brought in Texas and in Connecticut by a total of 10 victims' families. And now these juries will decide in 3 separate trials, the first of which begins on Monday, how much he needs to pay them. So, as you've seen, you mentioned earlier when we were talking, his bankruptcy filing, which failed. He has moved money around to a whole web of LLCs within InfoWars. He's doing everything he can to escape a judgment, which really does look like it's finally coming after 3 years of litigation.
I will roll on the floor laughing. It'll be fun. Do you think there's any chance he can be taken off air? Peter Thiel took basically Gawker down to where just basically erase them. Is there any chance that this could possibly happen?
I honestly don't know. I think it really depends on how successful the families are in locating his assets. And of course, the first thing that has to happen is that the juries have to decide how much that he must pay the families. So, a bigger judgment obviously would more severely impact his business. So it's really, by the end of September, we will know, because the last trial in Connecticut, this is a case brought by 8 victims' families, that will conclude by the middle of September. So by then we'll really know Alex Jones's fate. That'll
be awesome. I will be gleeful as long as he gets penalized, I suppose. He's technically tried to hide behind what the press has as the protection of the Constitution for free speech, and there's yelling fire in a theater isn't free speech. And so is this going to have any implications, do you think, if they decide on this to weaken free speech, or is it just going to maybe define it better that you can't yell fire in a theater?
It's a great question. I think, in a pre-trial conference last week, his lawyer was trying to press the case that once again, he's protected by the First Amendment and his right to free speech entitles him to make these claims. But the judge stopped the lawyer short and said, look, your chance to prove that, to use that as your defense and to have your day in court is over because you messed with the court system. He showed absolute flagrant disregard for the justice system. And so he was found liable by default. So he lost. So he no longer has the ability to use the First Amendment as a defense. Does that mean that he won't get on the stand and try? Of course he will, and he'll probably make some other claims about where his head was at when he was doing this. But as you say, the First Amendment does not protect people who spread known falsehoods, easily disproven facts, as truth, and that create harm for really vulnerable people.
Mm-hmm. Do you, in your book, what else haven't we touched on? Do you talk about what the Sandy Hook victims' families went through?
Yeah, I mean, what happened was initially the conspiracy theorists turned up on their social media pages. So Robbie Parker, whose daughter Emily Parker died at Sandy Hook, noticed that, he'd get a friend request from Adam Lanza, who was the gunman. Or people would show up on memorial pages that the families had created to honor their lost loved ones. And they would call them liars and frauds and accuse them of participating in a government plot to limit American Second Amendment rights. Or they began to kind of cross the virtual divide, come off of social media where they had kept up a lively, conversation, websites, videos, thousands and thousands of YouTube videos calling the shooting a hoax. But then they started to turn up at memorial events in the real world for the victims, to approach the families at their homes, dig through their trash, look at their windows, confront them on the street. And this happened for years. And the most recent incident of it was in 2018 when Robbie Parker, thousands of miles from Newtown on a street in Seattle, was accosted by a man who used every word in the book and called him a liar and said, "How long have you been doing this? And, how much money did you make?" And there was an actual confrontation on the street.
And the heartbreaking part of this is these people suffered so much loss already. And then to have to endure this on top of it.
There's a pretty significant secondary trauma to these individuals.
It's inhuman in some way, in all ways. Let me ask you this: it seems like the internet has a lot to do with this, and of course, Alex Jones really, I think a lot of people see his show, they want to grow up and be him, so they go, "I'm going to be an investigative journalist," and they see all the money he makes. Is some of this the horror of? It's too much to grasp in the horror of it, like 9/11, where a lot of this started, but really about the same time social media was hitting its thing with Twitter and stuff. But is it the horror of it, or is it just like people are anti-gun and they see that people, they're trying to use this to take our guns away? Is that any part of it? Just the sheer horror of it?
There are a couple. Yeah, it's a great question. There are a couple of things in play here. So early on, some of the people who were believing or wanted to believe that Sandy Hook never happened and that it was some kind of a hoax were young moms who had children around the same age as the first graders who were killed. They were sort of there. I interview one of them in my book. She said she was just there for anyone who could tell her that these babies didn't die in the way that the media said they did. And, those women were quickly disabused of that notion. And they became actually the first people who began to join Lenny Posner, again, the father of Noah, who's the youngest Sandy Hook victim, who had a tech background, who knew how social media algorithms send this content to millions of people. And he began an effort and a nonprofit called the Honor Network that was created to push back against these conspiracy theorists and to push the social media companies to limit the spread of this content. And his first volunteers were these women who had wanted to believe that this was a hoax and were quickly convinced otherwise, and then really wanted to help him fight back against people who were tormenting the victims' families the way these folks were.
Yeah. And I guess that would make sense. There's you send your kids to school, they're at school, you don't want to believe that this could happen in your neighborhood. And so you want to plug your ears and eyes and go, hear no evil, see no evil, listen no evil. I'd heard that from a psychologist years ago, that people sometimes struggle with events like this because they're so horrific. Putting their head around it is the thing. And I think that makes them more susceptible to people that, want to make money, or people want to be leaders. The Facebook groups must have been extensive that were made off of this, huh?
Yeah, and it took years for Facebook to take them down. One of the biggest ones was a group called Sandy Hook Hopes on Facebook, and it was run by the guy I mentioned earlier, the house mover from Florida, a guy named Tony Mead, who really made a name for himself on this, running this group on Facebook. And these folks would gather every night for hours, chatting into the wee hours of the morning, hundreds of people, just sort of, congratulating each other as they unearthed new aspects of the plot, as they sort of created. And, as some of the first Facebook groups when Facebook was born were organized around things like knitting. And so it reminded me of, those early groups, these people sort of embroidering this massive body of hoax material around Sandy Hook and later around other mass shootings or around coronavirus or around QAnon. And, building each other up and spreading it and just creating this massive blob of falsehoods.
Yeah. We have a lot of journalists on the show. We've had, everybody from every great format of journalism. I have a lot of respect for journalists. People really should. They usually study ethical journalism. They go to journalism school. They study ethics. Most journalists are really good at trying to keep their personal opinions out of stuff. They're good at interviewing both sides. And it seems like one of the problems with the internet and blogging and everything else, because I watched this grow up. I started on Twitter in 2008, started our blog for the Chris Voss Show, I think in 2009, 2008. It turns 13 years next month. I started blogging, but, we were talking about tech stuff. But we're always giving our opinion. And it seems like with the advent, the start of the internet became this real kind of identification of, well, suddenly everyone's an expert. Suddenly everyone's a journalist. Suddenly everyone's the smart people in the room. And then between journalists and our scientists, we saw that with COVID. Suddenly, no one believes them because, I saw a meme on Facebook today. So I clearly know more than some scientist who went to school for 20 years and has been at the IH, the Institute of Health, for 30 years. And I'm wondering how much of this, and people finding the suspicions they have. I've had people send me stuff and I'm like, oh, here's the 9/11 thing. I don't know if I got any Sandy Hook stuff over the years, but stuff that, and I'm like, come on, man, come on. They'll circle some obscure image and a screen capture. And you're like, seriously? I grew up with Bigfoot, right? So that was my first, I think, big conspiracy theory. Let me ask you this. In your findings, we've seen the advent of white nationalism and white religion. We've had a lot of people that on the show have come and talked about white nationalism and white religion behind it in the Trump years. And of course the conspiracy and the fake news and false news and stuff that he propagated. Did you find any of that behind it that was, that was a part of it? Because a lot of the stuff that's come out of these conspiracy things have come out of the religious end of the GOP party, at least in my understanding. I could be wrong because I'm not an expert.
Yeah, no, these conspiracy theories are really sort of born of a kind of grievance. So, this sense that the government is lying to you, that they are pursuing nefarious aims that you don't really know about, that they're covering things up. And the mainstream media is complicit in this. They work hand in hand with the government to press a government line, that type of thing. And then, when you have that sense of grievance, so you have theories that are born, or resurrected, I should say, like the Great Replacement theory. This idea among white Christians, that there are people coming from overseas, that immigrants are out to replace them, their jobs, their lives, their role in society. They're there to outnumber them. I mean, this is what we saw in Charlottesville and the violence there. It was driving some of the support for President Trump and his comments about building the wall and keeping immigrants out. All of these things kind of feed each other. It's like tentacles that spread throughout. And and the people who spread these things are obviously, they have certain personality traits, and they some of them believe this idea that they're being replaced, or that they are a diminished force in their own country. And then they are suspicious of the government, and they feel like they need to defend themselves. So they're very worried about efforts to limit the number of guns in this country. So it all kind of shades into each other. And, when you have someone like Alex Jones, he's sort of the apotheosis of this, right? Because he has these ties to these white nationalist groups. He is very pro Second Amendment. He's very suspicious of official goods and the government and the mainstream media. InfoWars name is not a mistake. He feels like, there is as he says, a war on for your mind. Is the government going to get you, the Democrats, or are you going to listen to me, Alex Jones, the truth teller?
Yeah. Throughout the history of man, there's always been prophets that have always profited off of fear. The boogeyman is under your bed, who's always going to get you. I'm an atheist. I grew up, it's interesting how these have evolved and what you talk about in your book, but I'm also thinking back to my youth. I grew up in Utah in the Mormon cult. We were always told that the Mormon church the government was going to fail. I believe even Mitt Romney's admitted to this. We were raised in the Mormon church teachings that the government would eventually go bankrupt, the government would fail, and the Mormon church would be rich enough to take over the country and save the country. It was like, this whole craziness. And for all of our lives, we always had food storage. So we'd have like a year's worth of wheat and crap and whatever the hell else. And I remember
like
seeing
bomb shelter in the old days.
Yeah, it's a wonder we didn't have one of those too. But there's always a thing that, the government's going to end at any time. I remember my father had all these books in his library, went out through and stole all his business books. He had all these books about, the coming end times of next year, and then for some reason they revise those books every year, I finally figured out. And, but yeah, it seems like this just basically went mainstream with the internet. Like it just went full out. Do you see it getting better or getting worse? Does Facebook have a lot to blame for a lot of this, or are we just getting dumber as a people?
Well, we're getting dumber as a people, but I do think that some of the dumber theories are, finding their way to more and more people, and we can thank social media for that.
Yeah.
And as we were talking about a little bit earlier, people get a lot out of this. We have a lot of people in this country who are feeling isolated and are searching for some kind of community membership in some kind of tribe. And sometimes they coalesce around things that aren't necessarily a force for good. So I think we see that happening. But the good news is, Lenny Posner, again, the Sandy Hook dad who took this on, because he had a tech background, this really became his calling. He has devoted his life to getting this material taken down, and more importantly, to warning the rest of us that this has reached a really critical state. And we saw with January 6th that belief in these kinds of theories and the willingness of these theories' adherents to confront and defend these falsehoods with violence has sort of reached a boiling point. And I think that's really important for Americans to understand. The good news is I think a lot of them are. I think there's a big conversation around misinformation online right now and the impacts that it has on people's daily lives and, more importantly, on our democratic system. So, is it still out there? Is it still really virulent and powerful? Absolutely. But more and more, there is a conversation around it and an effort both on the part of academia and by policymakers to try and explore some solutions.
Yes. One of the things why we love doing the show and having so many great authors and journalists on is seeing, not only the history of this country, starting with the great lie of the shining city on the hill, and all of the things that has spawned since, and all of the, issues we've had, and we struggle with. Sometimes I wonder if, we've talked with different authors and historians about the falling of the middle class, the dissolution of the middle class that I started to see when I turned 18. I started seeing that, the Reaganomics really started putting us into a point where the middle class started to disappear. And more, we've been at the fences where the middle class has been disappearing and just been under attack. You saw a large part of the reason people voted for Donald Trump, especially in the Rust Belts, were those people wanted their jobs back.
Yeah.
I can't remember if it was Eddie Glaude Jr. who was on the show or Jamar Tisby made a comment. It might have been someone else made a comment that basically white people started finding out what it's like to live in ghettos for the first time. And that's why they voted for Trump. And it's almost like as we've gotten more broker, our savings have become depleted. You hear about the economics of this country, wages not going up for 40 years, that the craziness gets more desperate. We had Ruth Bengate on the show with her book Strongman, and she talked about how a lot of these factors play into the rise of fascism and authoritarianism. And we've seen that arc over the last 4 or 5 years as to where, Germans were run down. They were, broke, recession, and they found a guy who said he'd fix everything. Yeah. And they're willing to sell themselves out as long as the trains run on time. We're kind of seeing that with Biden now, where people are like, well, I don't know, maybe we can have Trump back if he can get us lower gas prices. People willing to sell out their freedom and their democracy for as long as the trains run on time, until they don't, which they usually don't, eventually in fascism and authoritarianism. So sometimes I wonder if we're not on that track, or if January 6th was our pinnacle, and I don't know, we can claw back to.
It's a good question. I think it's a question on a lot of folks' minds, and you're absolutely right. There is, a lot of human suffering behind some of this. And in my book, I did, interview a few people who I noticed, and in their stories that they told me for the book, there's a lot of trauma in folks' backgrounds, and that sort of leads them to be distrustful. There's a lot of distrust in government right now across the board. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to feel like government isn't working for you, or that it's engaged in efforts that really don't benefit you and your family, or that it's let you down, or that the government does lie. It does cover things up. We have historical examples of that. The problem with a lot of these folks is that they will default to the government lies every time. The government is always covering up. The government is always pursuing something under the table and not telling us. And that's, of course, not true. And it also leads you down the path to, well, if that's the case, then there's a kind of nihilism that takes over. We may as well vote for a would-be dictator, or we may as well blow everything up. We may as well attack the Capitol, because there's nothing there for those folks.
Yeah.
They're angry. And, if you really believed that your vote in a presidential contest was stolen, if you really believed the lie that, Donald Trump spread and his allies spread, that the election was truly stolen from the swath of American people who supported him, you'd be angry too. You'd be in the streets as well. So, this is understandable, but what's shocking and terrible, and what really screams out for a solution, is the idea that you have so many of these people believing easily disproven lies like this.
Yeah. It's like I have friends, I'll do gaming online, and of course we review a lot of gaming products in the Chris Voss show. So we have a center for that. But I'll have friends that will say stuff on a gaming feed, and I'll just be like, what the ever freaking heck did you? And then I'll be like, okay, have you pulled that up on Snopes? Have you checked Snopes? Have you double checked that meme? And it's really interesting to me how lazy some people are, to where they get most of their political education from memes.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
I wonder, are they actually lazy thinkers, or is it that, more and more of us are looking for outlets that just affirm our point of view rather than genuinely educating us? I mean, it used to be the big three networks, the big national papers, your hometown paper. You could go to those and you knew that you were getting the truth. You might not agree with the various viewpoints presented, but you felt like you were getting a version of the truth. But then when you have people who believe different things or want to believe different things, we have any number now of media outlets that are geared towards satisfying that point of view. you're on the far right, you'll turn to Fox News or OAN or, Breitbart. If you're on the far left, you'll go to MSNBC, you'll turn to, liberal Twitter. But these are not giving you the real picture of what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I take my news sources from a lot of different things. I double check my stuff. I'm very careful. Of course, we have a lot of great journalists on the show, and we try and vault that up and make sure people understand how important journalism is, ethical journalism, and real journalists, not some guy who's in an RV in Florida. I don't know. I don't know. Is there anybody working for the WAPO that's RV in Florida?
It's an RV. I know. I just did a little mental search.
I was thinking of a picture today I got where there's an RV in Florida. Someone sent me it's covered in Trump's photos. Like, just there's nothing left of the RV. It's just Trump, misandrings and memes. But has any of the other school shootings gotten the sort of hate, blowback, doxing, and attacks like Sandy Hook? Why was Sandy Hook the worst?
Sandy Hook was the worst because it came at a watershed moment. So Barack Obama had just been reelected. There were a swath of Americans who were not very happy about that. They were believing that, a draconian gun control was on his agenda. That was one thing. But you really did have the rise in social media. So, in 2007, the Virginia Tech shooting, I went to a woman whose daughter was injured in that shooting. And I said, can you take a look at your Facebook page and just tell me, did anyone, because she became very active in the gun control movement in the aftermath of her daughter's injury in that shooting. And I said, did anyone ever call you a liar or attack you or say you were a fraud or you were working with the government, anything like that? And she went through her page and she was like, no, really nothing. But that was because, there were around the world in 2007, 100 million Facebook users. By 5 years later in 2012, the Sandy Hook shooting, there were more than 1 billion. Twitter had, 5,000 tweets a day in 2007 around Virginia Tech. It was really in its infancy. By 2012, after Sandy Hook, 5,000 tweets every second. So the idea that this hoax was, kind of bubbling up out of suspicion of the government, of the Obama administration, that was all there. But then there was that sort of tinder provided by social media.
Yeah. Didn't Churchill say something alike and get around the world in seconds and something to that effect?
Yeah.
And social media tend to amplify it. And especially like, Facebook, you looked at what Facebook with, am I pronouncing it right? Miramar, and different other things that they've kind of supported to let governments get away with stuff. And, they turned a blind eye for a long time to the Sandy Hook stuff, white nationalism.
Oh, the genocide in Myanmar. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like, Alex Jones is really the proponent that shined a light on that and took it to like the next conspiracy level. He saw the ability in social media to really extend and amplify his brand and his message and his business. So, when he was deplatformed in 2018, when all of these big platforms, Facebook, Twitter, even Pinterest, Pornhub, everybody kicked him off. He did experience a hit to his business. But at the same time, he has some really loyal, diehard followers. So they would find ways to get his content onto those platforms themselves. And there were loopholes that they could explore. But nonetheless, he was, his videos on YouTube had more than 1 billion views. So, if only 5 or 6 of those are about Sandy Hook families, that's an awful lot of people who are imbibing that content. And, a small percentage of those are going to act on it. Yeah. And the shareability of social media. I've had so much stupid stuff shared with me over time, usually 9/11. After a while, your friends kind of get the idea that you're going to call them out. And I've been really, I've been really tough at unfriending and disconnecting from people that want to spread stupid stuff. And I make a big deal of it. I've made a big deal on my feed for a long time. Check your sources. Don't send me some, or I'll call you out as a moron. It used to be that comedian did that joke that it used to be that when we had someone stupid in our midst locally without the internet, we just go, "You're a moron. Shut up and go away and go back to your whatever you're doing there."
Yeah.
But now, they can find each other, mate and breed, I guess. Anything more we haven't touched on in your book that we should throw out or tease out so people pick it up?
Well, I mean, if you all would post a link to the book, I would love it. That would be great. It's really important to the families who participated in the book that we all kind of get the signal that they're sending. They really felt like what happened to them was a warning for all of us. And, not just in the aftermath of mass shootings, but just the spread of misinformation that's affecting how our elections go, how we govern ourselves at the local level, how we run our institutions. And, that this is happening in individual communities to people who, really can't afford to, have any additional trauma or pain heaped upon them. So, and also to all of us to some degree. But yeah, I mean, there are efforts now to try and grapple with this. There is some bipartisan will in Congress, believe it or not, to do something, to, either inspire or, push these social media companies to act a little bit more strongly to rein in some of this disinformation that's spreading. And, that's hopeful. I mean, part of it is just having the conversation. And one thing I've noticed is that, as the book's been out these last few months, there are people who say, as they did after the shooting itself, I can't read about Sandy Hook. It's just too painful. It's too awful. It makes me cry, and to them, the families have said at some of the events I've done, for the book with the family members, please don't look away. Please do grapple with this subject because it's really important that we understand the nature of what's happening here. And, I talk about the shooting. I sort of establish the baseline truth of the shooting, but then I go quickly to the aftermath, to the real message of the book, which is, this is a foundational story of how misinformation is impacting our democracy and our society.
Yeah. And we need to understand what's going on, how it goes on. I'll paraphrase this, but evil survives or thrives when good people don't stand up and say enough. We're not doing this anymore. And yeah, there are things that are horrible in our life that we need to look at and go, yeah, we need to stop this. We've seen, of course, the shootings in schools and everything propagate, and there's all sorts of like, well, if there was a good guy with a gun, we saw Uvalde. That's not quite the same. What's interesting to me is how much the big lie and the lies all coming out of this, and Alex Jones was a big proponent of the Trump thing, is how much that took over the Republican Party and still does. We're still grappling with the big lie. Hopefully the January 6th Commission seems to be breaking through some people's minds. I don't know how far they're going, but it's kind of interesting. I remember when the GOP used to be run by the Heritage Society, the Federalist Society and Center for National Policy, and now they're run by QAnon almost, it seems. And and Alex Jones, and you're just like, well, that's not working out good.
Yeah.
One party that's gone that far off the rails.
Yeah, they certainly have a seat at the table. And if you look at Alex Jones's through line, as you just said, Chris, he shows up at all of those junctures. It was an Alex Jones video that brought the gunman to Comet Ping Pong, the pizzeria, that was targeted by Pizzagate believers just down the street from where I'm sitting right now in Washington, D.C. That was him. Spreading coronavirus myths. He's done that since 2020, since the very beginning. And he certainly played a role in inspiring people to show up in the Capitol on January 6th, 2020.
Yes.
And his role has been significant. So, he's a kind of Pied Piper for this type of thinking. And, it's not bringing us anything good in terms of, our survival of our democracy.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up with people always telling me, a boogeyman, and me having to go, what's the motivation behind your thing? And like I say, first time I went to Alex Jones's site, I saw all the products for, some of it was stuff I grew up with, the Mormon thing where there was the survival stuff, the food storage stuff, and all the world ends tomorrow, so get your branded knife, whatever. And I saw it and I went, okay, what's the old saying? Tell me your angle or whatever, and I'll tell you what you're selling. And I could see that, and I wish people were more cognizant of that and stuff and going there. But sometimes they like the message. Sometimes they like being the smart guy. Everybody wants to be that smart guy. It's like I always say, you always have these flat earther people running around and they're full of crap. Everyone knows the world's square. It's not round. It's square. It's not flat. I'm just kidding. Anyway, guys, there's a joke for the day. It's been wonderful to have you on the show, Elizabeth. The world is not square, guys. That was a joke too, by the way. Now somebody's starting a Facebook group. Damn it.
No.
It's wonderful to have you on the show, Elizabeth. Thank you for coming on and sharing your wonderful book with us.
It's my pleasure, Chris. Thank you so much for having me on.
And give us your .coms, if you would, please, one more time.
Absolutely. You can find information about what I do and about the book on Twitter, which is at NYTLiz. I have information there. And on Facebook, you can find me at Elizabeth Dittman, Dietmann Williamson.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks to my audience for being here. Order up the book wherever fine books are sold. Sandy Hook, An American Tragedy and Battle for the Truth. Please, I know sometimes it's hard to read about these stories, but unless we look, what I always say, look the dragon in the eye, you can't fight him. And we've got to be able to fight these dragons, fight these demons. If you have friends that spread information, either set them straight or, sometimes I just believe in, what's that thing you do in your parent where you give them tough love? Sometimes you've got to alienate them. My husky mothers taught me that with a husky. When a husky's bad, mom alienates the husky until the husky goes off and goes, oh, maybe I shouldn't be bad anymore. Mom will love me more. Which probably my mom did to me. I don't know. There's a joke there somewhere. I'm just wandering looking for a joke at this point. So anyway, guys, be sure to pick up the book. Certainly appreciate it. Also go to all of our accounts, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever you find our accounts sold. Be good to each other. Stay safe. And we'll see you guys next time.